everyone, to the folks here in the room and also to everyone tuning in. I'm Sarah Munjak. I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategy and Content. For us here at Consciously Unbiased, we are an organization whose mission it is to create more inclusive workplaces. All right, so I'm really excited to be here today. We're talking to four just amazing figures in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, also within the beauty industry. So it's a little bit of a niche topic today. Sometimes we don't go as niche, but I'm really excited we get to today. So our panelists are either in roles within this space, have held roles in the past, have plenty of rich insight and experience to offer. So it's a great opportunity for us to all learn from each other. So I'll give us just a very, very brief kickoff by saying that the beauty industry has seen a ton of change just in the past decade alone. So I'll just casually mention Rihanna's 40 Shade craze with Fenty, right? That has to be mentioned in this conversation, really kicked off a movement in the industry towards inclusivity. I know that can be a whole deep dive in and of itself. And there's these amazing tools that I found in the research before doing this, which really goes into the niche nitty-gritty of that. We have seen a ton in terms of gender inclusivity from a marketing and talent perspective over the past decade, to even just internal DEI budgets increasing by more than 75% in the beauty space alone. I found that in a study by 2021. So compared to the years before, 75% DEI budget increase. So that's significant just within the beauty space. So in terms of gender and race, as we've seen, there has been that significant investment, right? And we have seen the needle move. But studies have shown that there's been less movement in terms of diversity of ability and disabilities, body types, and social mobility. So there is still work to be done, as always, right? In this area, there's always work to be done, and it never ends, right? So I will leave it at that for now. I'm not the expert. These folks are. We can circle back to some of these points later. But for now, we have an amazing group. I would love to let each of them introduce themselves. Let's jump right in. Could you just start by saying who you are, what your connections to the DEIB space are, to the beauty space, anything else you'd like to let us know? Why don't we kick it off with Ashley?
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from, everyone. Ashley Gabb. I'm the founder and CEO of Gabb Consulting. We're a boutique management and consulting firm. We focus on connecting our clients' strategies and innovation to social impact. Prior to my consulting firm, I was the director of supplier inclusion and diversity for the Estee Lauder company. So welcome and excited about the conversation.
Thanks, Ashley. Really happy to have you here. Rob?
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Greetings to you all. My name is Rob Kaminsky. I am the Executive Director of the Estee Lauder Company's Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Center of Excellence. It is my 24th year here at the Estee Lauder Companies with a career that spans a very, very wide range of our business. I've had the privilege of being part of our Inclusion and Diversity Equity Center of Excellence for the last 6.5 years. My role on our team, I serve as the overall operational lead, leading operations here within the U.S., but also within the global space. Related to the work that I do here at ELC, I also have held a number of leadership roles within the diversity, equity, inclusion space with a number of our partners, the Conference Board, CEO Action for Diversity Inclusion, Seramount, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all here today.
Thanks, Rob. It's really great having you. Thank you for joining us. Kendra?
Hi, I'm Kendra Bracken-Ferguson, and I'm so excited to be here. This is such a great conversation. I am the founder and CEO of Brain Trust Founders Studio. We are the largest membership-based platform designed for Black founders of beauty and wellness companies. I'm also a general partner at our Brain Trust Fund, which is a traditional venture fund that invests in companies within beauty and wellness that have at least one Black co-founder. And I also host a podcast called Business of the Beat, which, guess what, is focused on BIPOC executives, leaders across the beauty and wellness space. We're in season 4, over 170 episodes. And through my podcast, I recently launched my first book, The Beauty of Success, Start, Grow, and Accelerate Your Brand, that also focuses on starting, growing, and accelerating a beauty business. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Kendra. Perhaps we'll have to drop the link in the comments to your podcast. I think folks tuning into this would probably want to check that out as well. So
Thank you.
let's definitely do that before the hour's over. Natalie.
Perfect. First, I want to say just it's such an honor to be on this panel with so many amazing people. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Natalie Overton. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Global Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Fresh, which is a luxury skincare company, a part of LVMH Group. I brought a little bit of our Fresh product. We can't really see it, but it's amazing to use. So I head diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I'll also say that I am a mother of a 7-year-old daughter, Olivia Grace. And so this conversation of beauty, while it does expand to every single person and being, it is very important that we're having, particularly as we're thinking about this next generation that we're raising. So excited to be here and share.
Absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. Really happy to have you here. So I want to start broad before we get into down in the weeds, but starting super broad, and I know I kind of kicked us off kind of lightly touching on this, but how does anyone want to take a stab at how has DEI within the beauty space changed over the years? I mean, I think if we're looking back, even just, I know I mentioned a decade earlier, but if you look back even farther from then and then where we are now, what have we seen change?
So I'm happy to start the conversation. Certainly having, and I can tell you from my own personal perspective, being part of the Estee Lauder companies for 24 years, just seeing such a great evolution, just in terms of what our business has looked like, but what does the beauty space look like? As somebody from a male perspective, when I joined this company, the focus was more on the female consumer, right? And we've seen so much change over those years. Looking at male beauty, what's your skincare routine? If you asked me 24 years ago, I'd be like, what are you talking about? But actually having that, be able to talk a little bit about that and why that's important. Products that are gender fluid that anybody can use, that I can use the same products my wife uses and the same fragrances. And I think that's so amazing. So we've seen such a great evolution that's been there. From an internal perspective, we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary of inclusion, diversity, and equity at the Estee Lauder companies. And it truly has been an evolution. It's an internal evolution. That concept of ID&E has always been here, but it's something that always changes. It has to adapt to the world that's outside our door for our employees, but also for our consumers. So it really is something that we continue to work for and continue to evolve as time goes on.
Absolutely.
I would add to that too. And it's so fascinating. I love the makeup of this panel and our perspective. What we're seeing in the studio is this interesting notion that, and we particularly sit in the realm of Black founders, but that Black founders are creating products for everyone. And we just launched our 2024 Economic Advancement Report. I'll drop a link in the chat. And we showed how our founder community went from 20 million in revenue to 100 million in revenue to last year, just through 200 founders, generated 142 million in revenue. And the majority of the consumers that were shopping were non-Black.
Wow.
And what we found is that we had founders who were scared to show their photos on their company websites for fear that I have a product that's for eczema. Anyone who has eczema can use my product, but because I'm Black, people are going to see that and they're not going to shop and they're not going to try my product. And so we have started to see this shift in the conversation when we think about cultural leadership coming from all diverse founders, creating products for the majority consumers. And so it's exciting to be able to be a founder. And there's still a stigma. We haven't completely, I know, I'm sure like Ashley through Gap Consulting is consulting so many brands on what to do, but we are getting to a place where we're hopefully removing the stigma of being a diverse founder, showing yourself on your brand page and people supporting you and buying you, knowing that it's going to support your specific need and not necessarily a skin type. Unless, of course, we talk about 4C hair, which we'll get into later.
Yeah, I'd love to build off of that too, just in thinking of how inclusion is becoming a non-negotiable, right? So we can think back to the 60s when Fashion Fair launched, which for those of you who don't know, it was makeup for darker skin tones or just skin tones that weren't pale, to be quite frank. And then we had Iman come out in the 90s. And so we've seen this through decades type of acceptance, but not this understanding of integration. So Kendra, exactly to what you're saying, now we're seeing that this is seen as a non-negotiable to make sure that we're reacting to what our market wants, which is more inclusion of everyone. Sarah, you were talking about Rihanna's shades now, which is Fendi, which is also a sister brand of LVMH. And I believe now we're at 50 shades there. And so that just even goes to show. Yes, well, no, but it launched just 40. So you are correct. It launched just 40 and has since expanded. And so even this idea of there's always things to go, there's always things to learn and integrate. But I think the most beautiful change is that understanding of integration. And it's not, okay, you go over here separate to the side and do what you need. Men's skincare, go over here to the side, do what you need, right? It's all of us together, which I think is really the true beauty of the change and evolution.
And I think these new companies, these minority-owned brands, are really changing the messaging in general, right? So they're recognizing, and I think everyone else is now recognizing, and it's important to say it's for everyone. So I think what Serena just dropped her makeup line yesterday, for everyone, right? And so I think the brands that were actually doing these things before are now changing their marketing, changing their messaging to make sure that it includes this for everyone. We have been testing on all textures. We have been testing on all skin types. We do have this variety in shades. And so I think it's changing what they're offering and how they're messaging. But then I think too, Kendra, back to your point in that economic kind of aspect of it is, I think what we've also seen change is the consumer, right? The consumer, diverse communities now have more buying power than they did before. So they're also kind of this external force that's making sure that there's a change in DE&I and more DE&I and representation in the beauty brand as well. So I think that's pretty powerful and amazing.
So I'm curious, and I'm sure other folks are curious, and maybe this is a difficult question, but let's say 25 years from now, or let's say we're in the year 2050. What do we think it'll look like then? Or do we think that, what are we working towards, you think, in the future within DE&I and inclusion in the beauty space?
I mean, I know you.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ashley. Go ahead.
I'll just quickly say, I think we'll see like more minority-owned brands emerging. You know, I think there's just going to be maybe, hopefully, more funding for minority-owned brands. But I think, again, as this buying power or this, economic availability, increases, I think we'll see more minority-owned brands kind of taking more space and more market share.
Yeah, absolutely would agree. And I think to touch on your earlier point, Sarah, you talked about, the focus on disability. I think that's a big one. Accessibility to products, being able to make sure that people can get to the products that they need. What's that experience at counter? So taking into account what that opportunity of disability is about, and how do we make sure that there is full accessibility? And we talked about for everyone, right? For products for everyone that everyone can access. I think that's super another opportunity to really pursue when we're talking about what the future of the beauty space looks like as well.
Yeah.
And I would just add, because I think there's two things. And Natalie, it's funny when you mentioned your 7-year-old. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and it is fascinating. And they have access to so much. They're reading so much. They're so interconnected, like from gender fluidity to who are we? And they're so connected. And so even when I think about what they're going to be doing and consuming and looking at, like, their whole perspective, it's just inclusive. And even the way that they shop. So Ashley, you mentioned like consumerism. It has to change, because we know that consumers are looking for products that we don't even have on our shelves because we haven't even thought, or we haven't given the opportunity, or we haven't funded companies who are creating the diverse products that are actually going to match the need of the diverse consumers. And Natalie, I'm sure you see it. Like, my daughter's 3rd grade class is so diverse, and you not to be crass, but you have no idea what ethnicity these children are because of the merging of cultures. And so there is a different need, and there's a big opportunity for new products. The way that we're shopping, from TikTok shop to YouTube shop, to how quick they're consuming information, the fact that my daughter is wearing a Laneige, chapstick, it's just such a different world of how they're consuming, who's consuming, what they need, and then what the consumer is even going to look like from a cultural perspective, because it's not going to be in the same boxes of which we exist and check now.
Yeah, I think that's actually a perfect lead in. Well, Natalie, I don't want to cut you off. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to add in quickly that I do also think there'll be a stronger focus towards this cultural social responsibility aspect. So like, where are we actually pouring our funds? How are we caring about our planet? We know that global warming is such a big conversation. The climate crisis is such a big conversation right now. And so I also see our future really thriving, those who are concerned about this as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that.
And if I can add one more thing, because I think kind of Kendra was talking about this, that cultural influence. I think we're also just seeing a lot of like international cultural influence in the US, right? Like folks, especially, you know, my younger teenage friends, not friends, but family members, they're actually on TikTok looking at what Japan is doing and what South Korea is doing. And so we're seeing a change in like our beauty standard and practices. And I think we're seeing a transition from where it was heavily US focused, and we kind of had that leadership for some time, that it's transitioning to other cultures and other regions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think technology certainly has changed the game. It's really brought the world closer together, and there's just been so many opportunities to see what's going on, you know, outside of the US or outside of our local area, and really kind of bridge that gap and really get those trends from other parts of the world and vice versa. So I think it's really opened a whole new arena, and really in terms of accessibility, but really truly inclusion.
Can I ask it, because Rob, you guys mentioned something, and Sarah, just you can steer me, but I think
please, go ahead.
Okay, because I was like, as you're talking, I think it's interesting, this notion of cultural appropriation. And I'm trying to figure out, because we see cultural appropriation in all different forms. We see backlash whenever it comes into different spaces. You know, I hear it so much from a wig, a weave, a braid perspective. And I just wonder, like, when we think about globalization and how our children have access, it's exactly what you said. Like, my daughter comes up with these things and they're learning about it, and then she's Googling and all of the things. But how does cultural appropriation, when we think about the globalization of beauty and we think about DE&I, how does that start to shift and the narrative start to change if we are going to blend cultures and we are going to bring in ingredients and ideas and trends into what it looks like to be part of the beauty industry in the US? So Sarah, I don't know. I was like, I wonder what they think.
I can share some thoughts on this. So Fresh is a global company. We have markets throughout our globe. And so, you know, something that is very important for me and our work is that we remember this term glocal. And so truly understanding what is the narrative of the history and the culture of the markets that you're in. What is the narrative in the history of the culture of where you cultivate your products from? And then how are you giving homage to that? How are you treating that with respect? So for example, one of our products, and this is one of the products in the campaign side, but one of our products, our tea elixir, we get a lot of tea from the Mauritius Islands. And so we actively work with their government to ensure that we are repopulating their environment with plants, and not just any plants, but plants that are culturally important to that geographical area. So I think that it's really ensuring that you have people in the room who are going to pause and ask that question, and who are going to take the time to understand the people, to build a relationship with wherever your markets are. Because when you start to do that, you start to understand, one, what the inclusion and belonging issue is, because every issue, depending on where you are in the world, is different. And then also, what does it actually mean to honor this company, right? Or I'm sorry, to honor this culture, to then work with people to ensure that you're sharing that. When I work with our China markets, I am talking to our teams that are located there. I'm talking to our people who are HQ, so they're in New York, but they grew up there. And I'm saying, hey, help me learn about your culture. Help me learn about, you know, the opportunities of beauty that exist here. So we always have to remember people first in it. And I think it's easier, right, to get to a place where we're not appropriating culture.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. I think it's really ultimately about local relevance, you know, having a global strategy or global vision, but, you know, how do we make that locally relevant, that it's not one size fits all? It's thinking about, when we're making these decisions, who has a seat at the table? Do we have the right people at the table? And more importantly, do they have a voice at that table, right? And are we hearing those perspectives? Are we taking those perspectives into account as we're developing these things? I think that's super important as we're developing a product or any vision that we're moving forward with.
And I would say supplier diversity plays a part in that as well, right? So, especially those companies like the Estee Lauder companies, LVMH, where you have global supply chain and global supply base. How do you make sure that you have diverse suppliers globally? And so Estee Lauder companies, set up their program and has it across the globe. And I want to say we had it in maybe 7 countries, and launched in China as well. So I think, partnering with diverse suppliers and making them a part of the product creation and the creative representation and all those things, I think is also important because it brings in that representation.
Yeah, I think, Ashley, have you noticed there's also been, in terms of supplier diversity, I've seen a lot of these bigger name brands increase their transparency about where their supply is coming from, right? And we've seen this in the food industry. We've seen this in various retail industries where it's like, well, if we're making this product and it's made in China, let's go to the factory and actually amplify the folks who are working there. Or I'm thinking of a specific brand. I forget what they're called, but they make hair clips. It's a great Asian women-owned brand, and they're really kind of subverting this notion of made in China in terms of supporting their roots and who they are, and then also taking a look at the supplier and really amplifying their name. And it's baked into their marketing campaign, so there's a ton of transparency there, and you're really uplifting and subverting an idea there. Have you seen that as well with sort of supplier transparency?
For sure. So I would say, first of all, when I talk about supplier diversity, I want to say it's, not just a part of your DE&I strategy. I believe supplier diversity is absolutely like a business strategy. It's a procurement strategy. You have to build that in. It's a business imperative. And so, diverse suppliers, they bring innovation. They help you have a more resilient supply chain. They are your partners, for the smaller suppliers, which not all diverse suppliers are small suppliers. I want to be clear on that. But for those smaller suppliers, they act as like your staff and, bring in a more personal, high touch approach. They're just as cost competitive, sometimes even, more cost competitive. And then they help with having an economic impact. But I'll share Estee Lauder companies. I think, Estee Lauder companies has done a great job. One of the few, if not the only prestige beauty company to make public commitments in this space, right? And so Estee Lauder companies made a public commitment to double their spend with Black-owned businesses globally. And they made that commitment to achieve it by 2023. They achieved and exceeded that goal last year. So kudos to them, Rob, and they also made a public commitment to increase spend globally with women-owned businesses. So certified women-owned businesses, that means that they're owned and operated by women. And they wanted to increase the spend to 150 million last year. They ended at 162 million globally with women-owned businesses. So they achieved that goal ahead of time and exceeded it. But I love to tell the story that diverse suppliers are kind of like a part of every aspect of the product, so from the third-party manufacturing and raw materials and the packaging to the creative agency that they're using to tell the story about the product to the supplier that they're, using to actually build the display in the retailer. They're working with diverse suppliers across the, end-to-end spectrum. And I think there's absolutely value there that you can see and that they're, working collaboratively with them to do. And other brands are doing the same, not just, and I think across the board, not just beauty. But I think, there's definitely some things to learn from Estee Lauder companies. I'll give a shout out there, but I know LVMH is doing some work there. Sephora, I'll give LVMH some shout outs as well. Sephora has a great program and is a great partner. And, one of our retailers, as well as, I think Moet Hennessy, as part of LVMH's, brand, is doing some great work as well.
And I want to add, because I love the data, because so much of this does come down to how do we say that we're going to do something, and then how do we show that we've actually done it through transparent data and transparent storytelling. And Ashley, what I love is that we can back it up. There's been I think what ends up happening is people make commitments or they say it, and then you don't hear about it, or you hear kind of the fluff of it without the actual numbers. And so in order for us to really make change and solidify that there are positive outcomes that are happening that are actually integrated into the entire organization and not just siloed in a DE&I team or a DE&I thought, but to be able to hear the stats that you've said about, I'm going to say it, I'm going to do it, I put everything in place so then I can do it, then I think that it removes any type of stigma that we're having, because we're showing that it works and we're showing what happens from a dollars and cents perspective. And I do think that so much of it comes down to the storytelling and the transparency. And so even Natalie, in terms of how you all think about it at Fresh, like you all are very clear on your website. You're showing your sourcing, your sustainability. And even when you talk about, we're going into this island and we're bringing it, we then have to talk about it from our perspective first, because I think that brands have to also lead the narrative on what they're doing so that they can kind of own the storytelling around the great work and how they're looking at it. And we give power to consumers, but I think if we don't talk about it and we don't say it, and a consumer reads that we went to this island and got this, and they don't understand how that ingredient is being incorporated, and that you do have a team there, and that you've done the research, and that you're giving back, then it does turn into this moment of what's the brand doing, or cultural appropriation, all those things that are absolutely not the case. And so if we can be in front of the story, if we can be transparent, if we can show the data of what we're doing to positively support what we've claimed we want to do, then I think that it mitigates a lot of this, and it really does position other companies who may be trying to figure it out to do it. I also think that it supports all of our vendors, which we actually need. We know that diverse teams perform better. So it does kind of complete the full circle when we can talk about it.
Yeah, there's two things I want to add to that. One, I love how we're talking about the integration. Something that people hear me say a lot is DEIB should be the breath of an organization. And if we think about our breath, you really don't understand your breath or become aware of it unless something's wrong. But it's integrated in everything you do. And so really we have to drive this understanding that DEI is a business imperative. It's a business goal, right? So everything we're saying, Ashley, that data was amazing. Estee Lauder, that's awesome. And you're correct. We also have our own goals at LVMH, but I think that it is so important that we truly are creating these data points that we're reaching towards, because that helps people understand it's not just a passion project. I mean, particularly in the States, let's think about 2020 and the amount of people who just got thrown into DEIB positions. I forgot to share this earlier, but I've been doing this work for a little over a decade in nonprofit and for-profit, independently. And it takes a while to truly understand how to do this work effectively, how to strategize, execute. And I think that, when we are saying this is a business goal, then people perk up, because they understand that there is a monetary connection to the work that we're doing. We're not just doing something to feel good. And then something I want to propose, and I don't know if this is a question, a thought, just something that I'm thinking through. So I love this idea of storytelling, and at Fresh, we're storytellers. We actually have a team of storytellers. And I think that there's always this beautiful juggle that we're doing between what stories do we share, and Kendra, to your point, how are we being ahead of it and authentically sharing these stories with people, paired with what do we do that doesn't feel like it's that appropriation, right? So we have Mauritius Islands was just one story. We know we have the people who wrap our soaps. We work with Pride Works, and they're 100% folks that have disability that sit here and wrap our soaps, which is beautiful, because our soaps are very intricate and challenging to wrap. And so, where are we finding this balance between, okay, we're just sharing all of our stories versus, all right, how are they just sharing the story to share the story? I mean, I think the answer lies into ensuring your stories are aligned with your values. But I wonder if there are some businesses out there that are pondering the same question as well. Like, how do I actually share my stories or give homage to something without people then interpreting it as appropriation? And again, I'm opening up a can of worms, because then I'm thinking about this concept of intent versus impact, which is another thing that the Freshies on the call are like, Natalie, you're saying things you say a lot to us here. But, you know, how are we helping our fellow brands, right? Because this story that we're talking about right now is bigger than us, right? This is a big thing. There's so much power that we have in beauty, right? So how are we all truly working together to ensure that we're supporting stories and also guiding when intention and impact don't necessarily line up? So I don't know if that's a question or just a random thought, but
and then, Natalie, I think I could take a quick, just like there's so much to address there, and I don't want to take up a ton of time. I want to let you all really own this, but I just feel like I have to nod to a couple things there, because it's funny that you bring up DEI, which is obviously my specialty, but also storytelling. So I have a master's degree in creative writing. And it's funny because these two things, Kendra, I see you laughing over there. But yeah, I think these two things really go together, right? So and it's funny because even from a personal perspective, so much of my writing, and I'm also, this is where I could go off on a deep end. So I'll also try to keep myself with rails up here, because I could really obsess just on this as a topic, because I'm biracial. And so I find myself also writing a lot into lineage and representation and also storytelling. And sometimes my entire thesis was actually just about feeling caught up about which stories I'm allowed to tell or comfortable to tell in which rooms, right? I can tell the story of my Mexican immigrant grandparents who crossed the border here illegally, and I can tell their story. But in certain rooms, you know, I also have my Jewish immigrant family, and I think, and depending on the room that I'm in, whether I'm also just white passing in certain rooms, speaking very openly, or whether I have my sort of like Latina, you know, hat on, and it being biracial and being mixed. And I know, Kendra, you also spoke about kind of like the feeling of being multicultural and ambicultural, right? With so many different terms being used today. We actually had a previous conversation a few weeks ago about global DEI strategy. And we had a great speaker on there. Her name is Dia Khanna. And she spoke about how in the United States, we don't really have as many check boxes for identification as other areas of the world. We don't even have a Middle Eastern checkbox when we have the self-identification checkbox often placed for various different items. And so it's interesting how in the United States we have this blend of who can and can't tell certain stories, and who is the spokesperson for that story, and who are they speaking to, who's in the room, who's leveraging a certain platform. I think this could be, Natalie, you really opened up an entire other I love it. I love it. I want to go. I want to go with you down this trail. I also there's a couple other points I wanted to talk to steer it back towards beauty industry specifically. And not that I don't think that you steered us away. I think this is very relevant, and I'll toss it back to Ashley, who I know had something to say next. But I'm always thinking about these things, about where are the stories coming from. And even in terms of cultural appropriation, you know, I remember speaking to like my mom or family members when they went to Trader Joe's, and for the first time they saw what Takis were being called at Trader Joe's. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Like, yeah. This is a very niche example here. But, you know, we're Mexican, they're Takis, right? When you go to Trader Joe's, I think they're called like spicy long trumpets or something like that. And then like they look like Takis, and you take them out of the bag, they kind of taste like Takis, not as spicy. They got to kind of tone it down, the spice there. But that's just, you know, an example of how whether and of course my mother she didn't know that could be a form of cultural appropriation. We see it there too. But I think like certain folks from certain communities see it happening all the time, especially in terms of whitewashing certain products and not giving that proper homage to, hey, this is a culture that has existed. You know, oftentimes we see founders come in and claim that they're finding something that it's not actually being found, it existed, or it's over here in this country, there's a huge industry just wrapped around this very product or this type of culture. And then you have someone kind of taking it to a new place. It doesn't have to be in the US. That kind of is claiming to find it, right? We see that happening around. So without going on too much here, I'll pass it back to, I think, Ashley, you were going to hop in here.
Yeah, but to your point, I think, well, that goes back to like where representation matters, like who was in the room that said, cool, let's do this. Like, you know, it's okay, you know, and we can create it to be our own. So I think, again, representation, but Natalie, to your point too, with like brands. And I think that's where transparency is really important and true commitments, right? So it isn't just like we're telling all these stories and we're trying to be relevant because that's what people want to hear. It's like, okay, can I trace what you're saying back to a commitment? I see you've made this commitment, or you've published something, or this is truly your value system, which again, you have to kind of like be transparent a little bit more. And now I can see, okay, this story, this effort, this initiative ties back to a commitment you actually made. And, some, when you birthed the brand, which is newer brands, you kind of have the ability to kind of, have been a part of the wave of for everyone or being inclusive. For older brands, you may not have had that, luxury. And so it still is like, okay, how do I kind of build it and to kind of steer the ship to go to now this new way? But still, I'm making this commitment. I think, again, back to Estee Lauder companies and quite a few others, leveraging their brand power, making commitments in this space. I think, another great example I saw of this kind of folks leveraging their brand is P&G. Back when they made their racial equity commitments, they created a platform for Black creators just to tell the story of, the Black experience, the Black complexities, the Black story. They weren't trying to tell the story, but they said, let's use our platform and give them the chance. And I think it was called widening the screen. So it is like, okay, well, how do you empower and kind of lend, like be an ally really, and leverage your brand power to allow these other folks to tell their stories and not, take it as your own.
And I agree. And the last thing, and I know, Sarah, you want to transition us, but that's it exactly, Ashley. And we worked with a company, a large company who was fantastic, a retailer. And it was interesting because we were in a meeting and it was like some people from the board, all representation across the organization. And they wanted to use Black Girl Magic. And this was years ago. And we did all of this research and we were like, you guys are not in a place to be using Black Girl Magic. You're just not. And we set out a plan, looked at the data, did a lot of conversation analysis, and we set up a plan to get them ready to, this was hashtag Black Girl Magic, by the way, to not even, but it was even just them trying to use that on their social. And it was like, you can't tell that story yet. And so through our planning, and Natalie, to your point, we put together a strategic approach to content and storytelling and what we were going to highlight, the brands we were going to highlight, so that it subtly flowed. And it took a year. We tracked it all to get them to be able to use the hashtag. But what we saw in the word clouds and the resonance and how people embraced it was we needed to take that time to get there. We needed to subtly see things. We needed to subtly show what we were doing so that whenever we did use the hashtag, it all laddered back up. And I think that that's where, even from a content perspective, there has to be the strategic understanding of the company. What are our pillars? What do we believe? And there has to be the true self-actualization as a company. Can we stand behind this? And Ashley, to your point, truthfully be able to show it. And that enables you, I think, Natalie, to go deeper with the stories. There's always going to be people who don't agree, but we can mitigate that and we can reduce that if we're laddering up our content strategy so that if we know what our end goal is, we can prove it along the way. And it's not so in your face, we're now going to say it, but it's subtly integrated.
Yes. One thing, I know we have to move on, but as you were saying that, Kendra, what popped in my head is it's chess, not checkers, right? And I share this a lot with our teams. The strategy, the time, I say, okay, give me, how many years do you think it'll take? Okay, let's add on 2, right? Like to truly ensure that you're integrating it properly. So just wanted to share that tidbit. It's chess, not checkers, particularly with this work.
And my final word, and I promise we're going to move on, is authenticity, right? Doing things that are authentic. Then it takes time to build that, as you said, Kendra, you have to establish that, and doing things that are not being seen as performative, and you have to have the framework that's in place to make it authentic. Now we can move on.
I don't mean to rush us. We can go anywhere we want to go. I think there's like 1 or 2 other points that I wanted to make sure we get to, but this panel has been fantastic. It's been such a great conversation. I feel like we could go on forever, and there's so many different directions to spin off of it. It's interesting though, like even just what Natalie was saying before about DEI, I feel like for an industry, it's one of the few times when strategies both in back of house and front of house, it's so all encompassing. It's the whole holistic thing, just from everything we're speaking about, all the way back from supplier and strategy and internal, we're not even talking about what's going on internally at the companies. We're not talking about like diverse hiring, or this is not really that conversation, but that's also what DEI straddles, right? Is internally at the company, but also front of house. Who's behind the camera for your marketing campaigns? Who's in front of the camera? Who's your talent, right? So it's so wild. And that's kind of one of the reasons I love DEI, not only because it's so important to me, but also it is one of the few things that really you can have your fingers, and you must have your fingers in everything to really look at the big picture holistically, so that every part of the whole working machine is moving towards the same beat of inclusivity and equity. And that's also why it drives the bottom line for any industry, because how are you going to increase more revenue? And this is a whole nother conversation, right, about DEI. But before I spin us off topic here, I want to pivot us a little bit in terms of startups and in terms of building brands, or either we know that with mission-based brands or Black and Brown owned brands, we know that VC funding, I want to talk about VC funding for a little bit. Kendra, this might be definitely more your arena, but we know it's historically low for BIPOC founders. In terms of the beauty industry and space alone, I'm curious, and I know some of the folks tuning in are probably curious, are we seeing the needle move here? And where do we think that might be headed with that?
So I can start. It's really interesting because we saw the lowest numbers of funding going into diverse, and in particular Black and Black women beauty companies that we've seen. And so it's really interesting because it's resonant with the overall, what we're seeing in terms of venture dollars going to, and I'll speak specifically into Black companies and women. It's resonant with what we're seeing overall. So there's a dip overall across the entire VC space. It just so happens to dip at an all-time low than what we've seen when we think about diversity. Now, on the other side of that, and Ashley, you said it, we are seeing more diverse founded brands go into retail. Thank you, 15% pledge, for opening everyone's eyes to see that. We're seeing more brands come to the table. We're seeing more brands double. Even, I linked in our economic advancement report, but we saw an increase of over 300 jobs. And last year, we only saw 112 jobs in terms of very specifically going into diverse companies and how they're growing and scaling their operations, which we know to get to a larger level, you have to have investment and capital, and you have to have a team. You can't be a solopreneur to battle the wave of what's happening from a competitive perspective. I think on the other side of it, though, because we're having more conversations, and, Sarah, we won't get into D&I being defunded and affirmative action and those things, but we are seeing a resilience, and we are seeing the people who have made commitments continue to step up and to create pathways of not just venture capital funding, but also the mentorship, the education, the access into retail. That's also going to help us drive forward. And I think, the other thing that's happening too is even from a language perspective, even within our own venture funds, we're a $15 million venture fund. We invest between $250 and $2.5 million specifically into this category. And we have to partner with the larger funds because we know how much capital it's going to take. Across the beauty industry, we're also seeing valuations are flat. And so that not only impacts the companies who have been doing it, who have been funded, it's also impacting so many of the smaller brands because the valuations look differently. The expectations are different in terms of the returns and exits. Where are smaller beauty and wellness brands even exiting now? So it's creating an interesting puzzle piece that we're trying to solve for as we think about what we can even say from a DE&I perspective and how we can ensure that those dollars are going to the companies who are meant to be diverse in terms of representation, if anyone's following what's happening there. So our mission, our goal is to make sure that we're creating more pathways for funding. We're getting ready to launch more enhanced capital opportunities, partner with more brands, lean into the organizations who have committed to the pledge, who have committed to giving more room for diverse brands, because it truly is the future. It really is.
Yeah, did anybody else want to speak towards that or anything that might be, tangential or relevant to that? I think there was a lot. Thank you, Kendra. That was really a valuable insight there. I think something that I'm thinking about is in terms of, we're speaking about diversity and equity here and social justice, which gets, looped into that. How can beauty brands advance DEI beyond the world of beauty? I know it's kind of also just a little bit of a bigger question, but if we're just thinking even bigger picture, I think, and it kind of goes back to we were talking before about pop culture and media and the world that we live in, which is so online. I think someone also put something in the comments here I saw about how Gen Alpha is able to carry out their beliefs in a way that other generations didn't always have the opportunity or access to. Thank you, Lizzie, put that in the chat. So this is, I don't know, maybe more so a comment or a thought here. Anyone want to speak towards us being more online, being driven by media, how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be advanced by sort of these giants in the space, in the beauty industry, which feeds so much into TikTok Shop and everything being online. How can we leverage that?
Back to being a fangirl of Estee, but I think when we think about like how they can be kind of an advocate and advance DE&I, one of the cool things that I've seen Estee do is really, it's almost like redefining what beauty is, right? So, who they're partnering with. So they had their first ever global change maker, National Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman, who's beautiful but brilliant, right? And so it's almost like redefining what beauty is by partnering and advocating, her work and what she does, because now it's changing the definition of beauty from just the physical appearance to now this initiative that they have, which is called Writing Change, to advancing DE&I and beauty and DE&I to be about education and literacy and change. And so I think, that there's also that responsibility to kind of use this, your power to advance DE&I and even social change, and see how you can connect with the right partners to go beyond just the typical influencers. So I think I love that Estee did that. And I think there's a shift there that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Right, Natalie.
I was just going to say, I did love the Global Changemakers. I think it's just such a beautiful story to emphasize, right? Beauty is more than just skin, right? It's deeper than that. I think too, with this opportunity of redefining what it means to be inclusive and what really diversity is, along with finding folks that are more than just externally beautiful. I think about at Fresh when we are thinking of dermatologists that we're partnering with, or even influencers that might not be as big, but are also trying to start their business or are particularly connected to nature. I just met a person the other day at one of our casting, and she for generations had been working with nature and using plants as remedies. And so how beautiful to kind of uplift this person's story as well, to help people see this dynamic of what beauty is. So I think it's more of that, because with that, we start breaking down what these stereotypes are that we think not just of beauty, but of people, right? I grew up in the South, a Southern Black girl from East Tennessee. Shout out Johnson City, Tennessee. If anybody knows Johnson City, Tennessee, we are best friends. But that's where I'm from. And I have to give homage to Beyonce's latest album, right? I'm going to go back to On Track, but it's just this understanding of, wow, this Black woman who can sing country, can sing opera. Well, yes, because she's more than that. It's this intersectionality of beauty that we're starting to see. And I really think that media, and particularly social media, is helping us redefine this and seeing people more holistically.
I'm on mute. I agree. And I think there's, because of, what is it, Gen Alpha, and because of the expression and because of how they approach the space, it's like this natural, beautiful expansion of DE&I that is very organic, just because of the way that they move and navigate and how comfortable they feel showing themselves. And I think that it starts to seep into everything that we do. And I think that it's very conscious as well, because and Natalie, you mentioned it earlier, and I think, Ashley, it goes into kind of the supplier diversity. Like, look at Human Race and having Braille on their packaging, for blind audiences. And I know they weren't necessarily the first company to do it, but when you compare a celebrity like that, their platform, as a voice that then shows how we are deeply rooted in making sure that DE&I shows up across all spectrums of what it really is, and educating that too is a form of DE&I. I think that then it drove us to look at other brands that are doing it and to highlight and to spotlight them. And so I think that that's the shift. How are we all using our platform, our narrative and voice to make sure that we're highlighting what it looks like through our actions, through our packaging, through our storytelling, through our narratives, and even through our employees? I mean, the fact that Rob has been doing this work at a company like Lauder for so long, before it just became every department now needs D&I. You didn't have it, go get it now. And so it's so deeply rooted. And I think that it's going to have to be ingrained with everything that we're doing, because it's the way of the world. And I will say this, and Sarah, it goes back to what you said, beauty and wellness, I love the category because I'm a beauty girl. But what I love about it from a capitalist perspective, from a revenue perspective, from a data perspective, from a good business sense perspective, is that is the only category that we put on our bodies, that goes into our homes. Like, there's amazing tech, all these categories, but everybody in the world has some form of beauty or wellness on their bodies, in their person, in their homes, from toothpaste to gel to Vaseline, whatever it is. And so our industry has to be at the forefront. And even when we look at the stats, and again, given my work, like we look at the numbers of Black consumers influencing trends across social media, influencing technology. And so we're already there. It's how do we highlight, Natalie, to your point in the casting call, how do we highlight these different voices that didn't have a platform? And how do we continue to work together to know that this is the future? This is the change. It's upon us. It's happening. And we have to, as the Lauders of the celebrities of the world, we have to embrace it so that we can make space for the smaller brands or the people that didn't have their stories to be told, because it just has to be ingrained in what we do. And Gen Alpha is going to make sure of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just truly ever evolving, and it's a continued evolution, and we have to evolve to it as well. Thinking about what's coming, what's next, and how do we adapt to that? How do we continue to stay relevant? How do we continue to find opportunities? I mean, I think that's a continuous journey that we share globally, and taking into many of those global perspectives as well.
I love that point in that it applies to everyone, Kendra. Like, it's the one kind of thing that it is literally on our bodies. It is affecting all of us, and that's really beautiful. I never really thought of that, but that's why it makes it all the more imperative and important. All right, so we are getting closer to the finish line here of our hour together. This has been a fantastic conversation, I have to say. I think folks who tune in can leave feeling like they just downloaded a ton of really insightful, not only just information, but seeds of dialogue to then take and speak to their spouse or partner or child or parent or friend. I think from this can stem out a lot of other interesting and important conversations that need to be had. We always end all of our conscious conversation panels with the question, what is one, so we've coined something called the micro-progression. It's the opposite of the microaggression. So the micro-progression step is one small action step that anyone can take, regardless of where they might be in the world, towards positive change to build a more inclusive environment. So we like to keep it super broad. Does anyone want to throw out what is something that anyone can do to work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable space?
I'll start. For me, if I have to say one thing, I would say awareness. Awareness precedes action. We talked a little bit about being an allyship. The first step there is really that education piece, learning, taking an opportunity to understand. So really, truly, I think awareness.
I'll jump in. Maybe just be you. I think if I could say it just be you, I think we all own some aspect of diversity. So diversity is not just gender or race, it's diversity of thought, of experience, of preference, of skills, of cognitive abilities. And so if we look at it that way, everyone has some element of diversity. And so if we give folks the space, and the way we give them the space to be them is by, being you authentically, it gives others the permission to be themselves. And I think that's probably the greatest gift you can give someone is the ability to be themselves. So start by being you and owning those diverse aspects of yourself.
I love all these. I think I would add to it, make space, right? I think that a lot of times there's this old saying diversity and inclusion, it's not pie, right? There's enough to go around. And so I think you make space intentionally by, in meetings, taking a breath before you're sharing. If somebody has said something and you're building on that, giving respect to the person who shared it first, like these little things that we can do in our day-to-day in our conversations. It doesn't even have to be meetings, that just simply make space for someone else to be seen and heard.
And I think kind of listening to what everyone is saying, I completely agree. And I think I would just add capital. And I think that capital is social capital, human capital, and then, of course, the dollars. And we need all of those to impact change. We need people to make and keep commitments when it comes to everything. So even Natalie, to your point, like having the space, that's human capital, making sure that we are at the end of the day giving space to everyone to be part of it. Our social capital in terms of creating the different spaces, the different opportunities, like making sure that it exists. And then it's the capital. So as companies, how are we investing in programs that are going to support this next generation? How are we investing in diverse companies? How are we investing in the tools, the education, the knowledge base to create these different spaces? And so I really think that we have to think about capital through those three lenses, and it has to be infused in how we are going to make change, impact change, and create sustainable change.
Yes, absolutely. Those were such great points. Thank you to the four of you. You're all doing such important work. I feel privileged just to have held space with you here today. If anyone listening would like to find you or tune in, or not that they have to find you, but if for any of you do any place you'd like to give a shout out, if someone says they want to know more about you, whether it be a website or anything like that.
Well, I just dropped in the chat. I've been using the chat quite frequently. But as I mentioned, my new book, The Beauty of Success, Start, Grow, and Accelerate Your Brands, came out February 13th. I have been on a 25-30 stop book tour. So I dropped the link in where you can find me, more information about my book, as well as Brain Trust Founder Studio. If you are a diverse founder looking for community, mentorship, education, and capital, please join braintrustfounderstudio.com. And I'm Kendra Bracken Ferguson, all over the web. Yes, using my entire name.
Wonderful. I'm sure folks tuning in will absolutely find that as a great resource. So thank you, Kendra.
And you can find me on LinkedIn, clearly, and gabconsult.com is my website. So you can drop us a comment, drop us a message, and you can find out more about me on gabconsult.com. Thanks again for joining, everyone.
Yes.
Yes, and for me, definitely feel free to connect here on LinkedIn. Happy to make any connections and follow up the conversation because, Sarah, I think you said it great. This conversation needs to keep going, whether you're a DE&I professional or anybody, right? We all have a stake in this. It's all our responsibility to really kind of keep this conversation going and to keep this conversation active, I think is super important. So again, thank you all for my panelists and thank you as well.
Yes, and Natalie.
Well, I would just say LinkedIn for myself as well. And Kendra, I can't wait to read your book.
Me too. Me too. I also cannot wait to read your book, Kendra. So
Thanks.
All righty. I'll just give a quick shout out that we have another one of these happening on April 18th. We haven't posted about it yet, but we have another set of amazing panelists. So tune in. Definitely. We'll post about that soon. Consciously Unbiased. If you haven't liked our page already on LinkedIn, you can keep up with all the panels we have out there. We also have a podcast called Break the Bias, where we have different entrepreneurs and founders on there as well, and just different folks doing this important work. So Thank you all. It's really been a pleasure. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend beyond. Thank you.